We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. We are here at the People's Summit for Democracy in Los Angeles. We're joined by Gail Walker. She's the executive director of the Interreligious Foundation of Community Organizations, IFCO, and Pastors for Peace. Gail, welcome.
Thank you, Brian.
We were just at the opening session of the People's Summit for Democracy. This is, of course, the alternative to Joe Biden's hosted Summit of the Americas that has excluded Cuba,
Yes.
excluded Venezuela, excluded Nicaragua, and many other countries as a consequence of their exclusion have decided not to join, or at least not to send their heads of state.
Right.
You were on a panel this morning at the People's Summit, the Alternative Summit, and you were talking about democracy. Democracy for whom? And you made, I think, a really important point, because the United States has excluded Cuba on the premise that it's not a democracy, that Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua are autocracies or authoritarian states. And you describe Cuba as a participatory democracy. Of course, each government, each system is different. But what do you mean Cuba's a participatory democracy?
Well, that's one of the great things about Cuba, is that, you know, whenever you've had an opportunity to travel there, to really sort of see the way in which they have really defined what it means to be a democratic nation. For example, the elections. I mean, the fact that, you know, in the United States, when it comes to elections, you've got to be wealthy, you've got to be able to have money for the television, advertisements.
They spent $2 billion on just television advertising in the last election.
Outrageous. So Cuba, you'll see that, people may be running for a particular position. It's a very simple placard, picture, a very short bio, and the people are held accountable by their neighbors. And, if they act up, they're out. But that's the way a democracy ought to act, is engaging the people. And that's just one example.
I would think most people in the United States who know almost nothing about Cuba, because the blockade of Cuba, which is designed to deprive Cuba of food and medicine and the things needed to sustain life in modern society.
Yeah.
The blockade also has blockaded Americans from learning the truth about Cuba. I would guess most people in the United States, if asked, would say, no, Cuba doesn't have any elections.
One of the first things that I mentioned, I went many years ago, but 1992, that was my first trip to Cuba. And one of the things, politely, because I was raised to be polite, but I said, so how do you deal with it? You all don't have elections. And I got a lesson in civics in Cuba. But you're right. I think that's the situation, that there are so many people who don't know. They really don't know the reality. The information blockade is so real. It's pervasive. Our media, our schools, our elected officials, our churches, or wherever we go, we've received nothing but negative propaganda about Cuba. So that's why the only way for people to really get a sense of the island is to go and travel there and see it for themselves. Interact with the Cuban people and see and ask those questions and learn, because we won't learn otherwise unless we go and we interact.
Yeah, well, one thing about participatory democracy is it means something more than voting as well.
Right.
Because, in the United States, people have the right to vote every 2 or 4 years, including the homeless. They don't have the right to a home, but they do have the right to vote every 2 or 4 years. Anyway, let's talk about what it means to be a participatory democracy outside of voting. Again, I think the reason we want to emphasize this is that the Biden administration, which has not lifted the 243 additional sanctions or coercive economic measures imposed by Trump after Obama. Biden hasn't lifted them. He's saying, look, the Cubans can't come to Los Angeles. They can't participate in this summit because they really are a dictatorship. You're taking a completely contrary point of view. You're saying, one, they have elections, And two, there's more to their democracy than just voting. Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. I mentioned during the presentation the CDRs, Committees in Defense of the Revolution. Essentially, Brian, those are block clubs, right? So any of us that are community organizers, we get that. But we've got the Cuba, which had just had the triumph of its revolution, and said that, we can't do all of this. Those of us who were in the Sierra Maestras and made our way across the country, we can't be the ones to impose, the
the
systems.
Government.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that the way to actually engage people and make sure that there really is a sense of connectedness, of belonging, of that this is our system, our democracy, is to empower people to be involved, and that's where the participation takes place. So we've got the CDRs, for example, that were very instrumental in helping to educate people about various aspects of Cuban society. Most recently, as I was mentioning, this family code. The family code is an effort by the Cuban government to revamp their constitution. I find that fascinating. I mean, should I say how old I am? Why not? I'm bold. I'm 63 years old. The whole idea of the United States changing its constitution, the people being able to discuss and dialogue and be engaged in what that process looks like is just fascinating to me.
Well, it's interesting. I don't mean to interrupt, but it's, based on this, the recent leaked memorandum from Samuel Alito from the Supreme Court,
yes,
basically extinguishing abortion rights for women. The basic legal argument of Alito is that if a right did not exist in the U.S. Constitution in 1787 or in the subsequent amendments, it's not really enshrined in U.S. law, meaning it can be taken away.
Right.
So, Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, marriage equality, abortion rights, that's all up for,
yes,
the taking at this point. And the right wing in the United States is taking it. They're taking it. Unless people fight back, these rights are going to disappear. Let's just talk about that kind of democracy. What are people entitled to in Cuba? What about healthcare? What about abortion? What about education?
Absolutely.
What about these rights? And then, again, I want to go back to the idea that the people of Cuba are reshaping a new constitution. And I know that, when there's been proposed changes, these discussions take place in factories and offices. They're everywhere.
Yes, yeah. It's really, like I said, fascinating to see that kind of conversation taking place and people being able to actively engage in the process. The fact that Cuba has really made these opportunities possible is very significant. And when we really look at our own nation and we see the ways in which when we try to evoke change, for example, let's say that we vote in a politician who we might be able to agree with their push for policy change. That's all fine and good, but it often does not mean that it's lasting change. Too often, the next set of politicians will come in and reverse things. And that's certainly what has happened once Trump came into place. I mean, once we looked at these 243 these terrible measures, that was a part of Trump being able to really flip the script on even what Obama had done, limited as it was. And then, of course, we've got, like you said, Biden, who has really manipulated the situation so that he is, I think, what often politicians in the U.S. are doing, which is to save the space for their party for the next election. So, for example, you might have, let's say, a person who comes in as president, and we're thinking, all right, we're excited that this person is going to, make some adjustments and some changes. And so often they'll wait. They wait until maybe the second term because they don't want to lose in the midterm elections. And you think, okay, I'm waiting. Okay, now we're ready. We're going to really make some substantial.
Waiting.
We're always waiting.
Yeah.
We're always waiting because that person is always going to be saving space for their party for the next election, and that's the cycle.
That is, you're right. You're totally right. I mean, when you think about the election of Barack Obama, of course, we'll we credit Obama for changing, in some small measure at least, in an important way, U.S. policy towards Cuba. The embassies reopened in Havana in the United States the first time in 54 years.
Yeah.
The sanctions weren't lifted, the blockade wasn't really lifted, but it was a promising start.
Yeah.
But if you think about Obama in 2009, he was very popular. He had most young people in the United States were very excited. There was a kind of euphoria. The Democrats had 59 votes in the Senate. There was an independent senator who was voting with the Democratic caucus. So that's 60. So even with the so-called filibuster rule, they had the votes to overcome it. Very big majority in the House of Representatives. And so Obama could have done pretty much whatever he wanted to do. He could have, for instance, had single-payer health plan, meaning that everybody is going to have complete access to health care services.
Sure.
But instead, he adopted Mitt Romney's Republican governor of Massachusetts plan, the Republican plan to privatize health care. And the premise was, Obama was like, we don't want to go too far and too fast right now, even though they had all of these majorities in the House and the Senate. So here we are in 2022, and all of the services and all of the hopes, all of those dreams for basic things have been basically eroded.
Yeah.
So the logic of the American bourgeois political system is that the checks and balances are always checks and balances against people's expansive rights, where in Cuba, these rights are legal. Nobody's going to take away your right to free health care.
Yeah, no, absolutely. To free health care, to education, for you could go as high as you're interested in. And of course, you know, those of us who have loved ones, children, young people that are struggling to figure out how is it that they can get a college degree, because it's supposedly with the promise that you'll be able to get a good paying job so you can take care of your families. That's a whole nother conversation for another time. But the fact that Cuba has recognized healthcare, education, housing, I mean, sustainable development, that these are rights, inalienable rights that the people possess, and that they've got to be at the forefront of whatever it is that we do for our population, is very different from obviously what we experience here. But that's part of what makes, I think, Cuba different and interesting, and also that threat of a country that is saying, oh, healthcare, that's a right. Education is a right.
When you think about it this way, I mean, we're here in Los Angeles, a lot of money here in Los Angeles, a lot of wealth. There's also a lot of people on Skid Row. Right. Like this class schism, this class divide is so obvious and apparent in Los Angeles. Cuba's not a rich country. I mean, Cuba's blockaded, it's an island country, it's had the legacy of underdevelopment from colonialism. I mean, and yet, it's able to guarantee these basic rights to every person. So if you know you have a right to a home, and every Cuban does, you know you have a right to go to a doctor when you're sick.
Yeah.
And the committees for the defense of the revolution, each of those blocks have a doctor or a nurse or some set of healthcare professionals, so the doctor's always in.
That's right.
If you know that, if you know you want to go to college, you can go to college and you're not going to have a student debt. In fact, it's free. I mean, just the set of values and the sort of the comfort, perhaps, that people would enjoy in Cuba, even though it's poorer. That kind of basic social structure is so important for human beings. Yeah,
no, it absolutely is, and it's a commitment that Cuba, that the government, that system that Cuba has embraced and adopted is putting people first. Truly, it's not just a phrase. I mean, that there really is an effort to address the needs of the people, and that's a tremendous example for those of us who are struggling for justice, no matter what country, not just in the Americas. I think in the world, we all want safety and security and care for our families, and Cuba really does, I think, make that a priority. Like you said, it may not be the fanciest hospitals, it may not be maybe certain things that people are expecting, but the commitment is to care for people at the most basic level, and that's a gift, and that's a beautiful thing that we need to be able to support and continue to lift up.
Pastors for Peace, IFCO and Pastors for Peace, you take delegations to Cuba, people get a chance to see Cuba, you bring material aid to Cuba, sort of as a small antidote to the blockade of Cuba. It's basically symbolic, but you're making the point.
Right.
You're doing everything to lift the blockade of Cuba.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what would happen if Cuba didn't have the blockade? I mean, with this level of education, these values, this kind of community.
Yeah.
When you think about this island sending doctors all over the world, creating its own vaccines in the middle of a pandemic, in spite of the blockade. Just let's imagine, what would Cuba be like without the blockade?
Yeah.
I mean, Cuba would be the jewel of the Caribbean.
Absolutely. And the thing is, Brian, I think that there are many in the Caribbean and the world who recognize Cuba as such, recognizing that there are limited resources that the island has, but that what they have, they're willing to share. As I was speaking earlier, I talked about a U.S. government who was dangling vaccines as if Cuba, which has already manufactured 5 vaccine candidates, 3 of them viable. The United States government said, if you're good and if you do what we want you to do, we're gonna, we'll give you some vaccines. And the Cubans said, thank you, but no thank you. But let's work together to deal with the vaccine apartheid that's happening in our own hemisphere, specifically in Haiti. And of course, there was no acceptance of that. But the point is that Cuba has always, I think, represented that incredible tremendous example of what it means to really stand for not just itself, but the rest of the hemisphere. One of the things that I didn't get a chance to say earlier is that Cuba is, that all of these struggles, it's not uniquely Cuba that is experiencing this. The various countries in the region, so whether we're talking about Honduras or Nicaragua, Venezuela, certainly, but others in the Colombia, that the stories, the foot on the neck of the people of the government of Cuba, that story can be replicated for the various other countries in the Americas. And that's why it's important for us to unify and to be supportive. And that's why it's so important that there were voices that said, if Cuba, if Venezuela, if Nicaragua are not present, this is not a legitimate summit, and that we will not be there.
The president of Mexico chose not to come, and he made it very clear. He said, if the parts of the Americas, and substantial and big parts, and parts that are even bigger than their numbers. I mean, Cuba plays an outsized role in the world, but also certainly in Latin America. If they're excluded, we're not coming. He's not coming. I mean, this is one of the, I think Mexico is either the 2nd or 3rd largest trading partner of the United States. It's a huge country. A huge amount of trade comes across the southern border of the United States. I mean, here we are in 2022 when Biden and Blinken and Jake Campbell and Kurt Sullivan and Victoria Nuland, this whole gang of neocons say, look, we're going to decide who's eligible to come and participate in the summit of the Americas. Maybe at one time that would have meant that the government in Mexico or the governments in the Caribbean would say, oh, well, we don't want to get on America's bad side. So we'll just, we don't agree. We think Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua should be included, but, we'll just kind of, we'll just suck it up.
Yeah.
That's not happening anymore.
And it's this incredible, in many ways, sea change. I mean, I think that there's this sense of, as a unified body, if we're pushing back against the U.S., the bullying tactics that they've put into place all these decades, that we can succeed. And I think nations were emboldened by the kind of collective response. So, you had one nation after another that were stepping up to say, this is wrong, this is unjust, and we're not prepared to do that. But you're right, in the past, I think so easily people were manipulated, were threatened, were convinced that they needed to stand in solidarity and stand beside the U.S. and count, speak that line. And there's so many that have said, we're not doing that. And let's hope that,
yeah, it's a sign because, when we think back to the last few years, and I know you're working, of course, constantly in solidarity with Cuba, but you're also in solidarity with Venezuela, for instance. When you think about what happened under Trump, where Trump announces by the way, Maduro's no longer the president of Venezuela. Juan Guaido is the president. They start seizing Venezuelan assets. They actually physically seized Venezuela's embassy in Washington, D.C. in violation of the Vienna Convention that says diplomatic compounds are inviolable. You would think like, wow, Nicolas Maduro's days are numbered.
Yeah.
Because here's the U.S. They're sanctioning Venezuela. They're strangling it. They can't even sell their oil. There's runaway inflation, lots of class and political differences.
Right.
But here we are, 3 years later, Maduro's in power. The U.S. has tried to do the same thing to Ortega and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, Cuba. You know, yes, the U.S. has great power, you know, far greater than any other country, but there's a limitation on the power. And that limitation is, I think, more than anything, a reflection not of the U.S. limited military power, but the political power of people actually as a block or a barrier or a restraint on U.S. power. So Venezuela today survives, Nicaragua survives, Cuba survives, the Caribbean nations, even small nations, saying we're not coming to Los Angeles if Cuba can't come. I mean, it is a real sign that we shouldn't only think about power as the power of the gun, the power of the tank, the power of the missile, the power of the dollar. There is the power of the people, and that's, in a way, the message of the People's Summit for Democracy.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that that's what has really, like I said, emboldened other nations to just say, we don't have to just kowtow to U.S. policy or U.S. Position, and that if we are not just with other nations in the Americas and the global South, but just across the globe are able to unify our voices, we can push back against the intimidation of the U.S. government and its policies. And I think that that's exactly what's happening. And it's an exciting moment. I think that what we've got to do, we, meaning the people in the U.S., the very country that is, whose government is creating these conditions, whether that be in Cuba or in Venezuela and Nicaragua and elsewhere in the hemisphere, that we have a responsibility to speak out against these actions and to do what we can to lift up the truth and to push back against that information blockade that's not only being perpetrated about Cuba, but various other countries in the region. But you're right. Nicolas Maduro, if we listened to the White House or mainstream media, would have been gone a long time ago. But here he stands, and people I think scoff and laugh at a Guaido. There's a little meme that was circulating where there was Obama whispering in the ear of Biden saying, "Man, you better get it together. This whole summit's going to fall apart." And then there's in the second frame a picture of Guaido saying, "I'll be there." And I think that it's a joke. It's a joke for the rest of the world, and certainly most of the world, most of the people, even I think in the United States, don't even have any idea who Guaido is. Anyway.
Yeah, one of the things about the blockade that you mentioned, the information blockade, is that the People's Summit for Democracy actually invited 23, I believe it's 23 Cubans, doctors, authors, sports figures, academics. They invited them to come here to participate. And so not only was the Cuban government excluded, but Cuban civil society was excluded because the U.S. government, the State Department, refused to give a visa.
Yeah.
Now, in the opening session, Democracy for Whom, that you spoke on the panel earlier today, there was a video message of one of the people whose visa was denied.
Yes.
It was extremely impressive. I mean,
very.
She told her story. Anyway, let's just talk about what she said, and why is it that, from your point of view, that the U.S. government is so afraid that if a Cuban healthcare professional like this woman is allowed to come and speak in Los Angeles, like somehow the sky is going to fall.
Yeah, exactly. Cristina Escobar, who's a journalist and a beautiful, wonderful friend. it broke my heart as she was talking about this child who was not able to, I think she mentioned it had cancer or needed
a liver transplant.
And we know too many cases. I've had friends who have who passed away because they've not been able to receive the medicines that they needed. Medicines that were manufactured in the U.S. or a portion of a medicine was manufactured in the U.S. and therefore unable to legally be sent to Cuba. Those are real stories in very real terms. People are suffering, not because Cuba can't produce and care for its own people. It certainly can. It's produced 5 different vaccines to fight COVID, but it's the U.S., manipulating and putting pressure on other countries and other companies to suspend trade, to suspend relations with Cuba. And that's really what the boot on the neck of the Cuban government and the Cuban people is. So it's important that we lift up, what it is that Cuba is capable of doing, and that we really make clear that the challenge that Cuba is dealing with is a policy that has continued to try to strengthen, not to strengthen, but to strangle the Cuban people. The claim that the U.S. makes that, they care for the Cuban people is a fallacy. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that it is the Cuban people who are expendable pawns in the U.S. government's efforts to continue to dominate the hemisphere. So there's so many different ways in which the United States government's policies have been harmful, but the resilience is tremendous, and that example is what we continue to lift up.
And if the American people, if her presentation, which was really beautiful and touching, if that was on CNN or MS or NBC or any of the mainstream media, I think majority of people in the United States would say, what? The policy towards Cuba is depriving parents of saving their children who need a liver transplant. In other words, something that can be survived. The American people don't really know about this. The government hasn't really told the truth about its policies. I went to Iraq in 1998 bringing medicine because Iraq was blockaded, and I went actually with your father and Ramsey Clark and your father, Reverend Lucius Walker. And right before we were about to leave, the the Justice Department was threatening to indict us for bringing medicine to Iraq in defiance of sanctions. So they said, we're breaking the law. And we were like, go ahead, arrest us.
Exactly.
We'd love to have that trial because the American people will find out that you're putting us on trial for bringing medicine to babies who you're depriving of getting medicine, so those babies are dying. Because the American people, if they learn about the policy towards Iraq, the sanctions, the fact that there's killers, the American people will turn against the sanctions.
Exactly.
My point is that isn't it the most important thing, because we can't count on the government to change the policy, to do the things like Pastors for Peace and IFCO is doing, which is to reach the American people with the truth about what the blockade, what the so-called sanctions mean on the Cuban people. If the American people know, I think they will join us in the struggle to demand that this blockade end.
So true, Brian. One of the things my dad used to say was, this is a win-win situation. If they stop us, we win. If they don't stop us, we win. We take our aid, we take our supplies, we control the narrative. We talk about what it is that the blockade is in real terms. If they stop us, if they arrest us, saying that we're, breaking the law because we're taking medicines to babies, bring it on. Bring it on, because that's really doesn't do anything but help to underscore the injustice of this policy and the righteousness of people who are willing to stand up and fight against a policy that would deny this child the ability to have the medicines to save his or her life. So it's important work that we continue to do. We win either way, and that's why we continue to do the work.
Okay, with that said, and final point, if people wanted to join Pastors for Peace, become a volunteer, become an organizer, send your support in whatever way, want to go to Cuba with you.
Yes.
How do they do it?
They contact us. They can write us at IFCO at ifconews.org, IFCO at ifconews.org. The office is periodically open, but you can leave a message, 212-926-5757, 212-926-5757. But there are, the website is also another way that you can communicate with us, ifco@ifconews.org. But we would love to have as many people. We've got 100 people lined up to go with us this summer.
Yeah.
Our hope is that we will continue to organize delegations, caravans. The important thing is for people to go and see the reality for themselves. So, yeah, we welcome people to participate, volunteers. Come on, there's plenty of work to be done.
Gail Walker, thank you very much.
Always good to see my brother, Brian. Thank
Okay.
you.